Thank you very much for that fascinating presentation, John. Next up, we have a fantastic roundtable for you, filled with a whole range of wonderful guests to be talking and really building on some of those topics that John mentioned there. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to the moderator of said chat, Ma. Ma, are you there?
Oh, Callum, I'm here.
There you are, looking resplendent as always. So I will hand it over to you. You can introduce all the speakers, and I'm excited to hear what you've all got to say.
Thank you, Callum. And welcome everyone to our panel on creating culture of tech and innovation. My name is Mar, and I'm an editor at T&W. In addition to John Egan, CEO of L'Atelier, who we heard from just now, we are also joined by three other speakers, Nancy Knowlton, John Cydwick, and Marit Janssen. Nancy is the CEO of Nureva, a tech company focused on creating physical and virtual collaboration spaces and advanced conferencing solutions. John Cydwick is the president of the Collabtech group, which is also helping companies to collaborate virtually using the best tech. In addition to that, he's the vice chairman of the industry association, AVIXA. And Marit is a transformation consultant at ABN AMRO, where she focuses on the culture, leadership, and behavior changes needed to make digital transformation initiatives a success. Marit will also stay for a quick chat in the studio after the Q&A portion of this panel. And finally, I'd like to remind everyone watching at home to send their questions in the chat, tagging them with @Q&A. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks.
Yeah. Let's start this off with a question to you, John Egan. You mentioned non-virtual brands were entering the virtual economy, and it demands a new skill set, such as being able to design for Fortnite. Are there any roles that are specific to collaboration that business leaders should be on the lookout for?
So I'll try and respond only once this time. There are certainly a number of new intermediary services that are emerging within the space, which is the same as you would see in a real world economy. As any new economy develops, we begin to see infrastructural intermediaries that are there to facilitate collaboration or interoperation between different kind of islands within this emerging archipelago. So it is, when we're talking about business leaders and looking at brands who are beginning to enter this space, I think what we are seeing in live action is this emerging form of collaboration that is between kind of traditional old world industry and this very new set of skills and these very new business models, which may seem unfamiliar to traditional industries. But I think the brands that have entered so far have done a reasonably good job at being kind of authentic and empathetic enough to understand that they're non-expert in these spaces and require those skills and resources from those people who are native to these environments.
Yep, thank you for that. Now, let me ask you, John Cydwick. We, of course, can't really have this discussion without knowing what technology is coming up. So what technology have you seen a lot of investment in since the beginning of the pandemic in terms of collaboration? And how is that different from previous years?
Yeah, I think technology is driven by what the people's requirements are. And there's been a big shift in the last few months since March. And actually one of the major changes is not just people working from home, but it's the trust element. You know, companies having to trust people now working from home and empower them to work from home. So we saw immediately a big move of obviously personal technology, particularly around laptops. And that was followed very quickly by things like webcams, anything that was portable. In fact, people were stripping offices out of anything they could just to get some communication and collaboration products into their home environments. And that obviously differed from where we were sort of a year ago, whereas it was just the laptop was good enough. And now we're seeing a move, or there has been a big move to making sure that the home office environment, you know, this working from home, which actually most people feel like it's living at work, is a type of office experience, much more enhanced, higher quality. Because if you're spending hours on a call, you know, you could spend whole days on Teams calls. You've got to make sure that A, the experience is good for you, and B, it's good for the person that's receiving your image and your sound signal. So big focus on really emulating what was the huddle room is now the home room. And I think that's a fundamental change, and it's built around people's work practice. And that trust environment is really important because companies having to trust the fact that people are actually doing their jobs and they need the right equipment to be able to do it.
Yeah, so we're seeing a certain tech upgrade from people's home offices. And of course, leaders do need to be aware of new technological solutions. But you, Nancy, you have mentioned that perhaps many of us get too hung up on the technology at times, ignoring other aspects of innovation. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I think that's a very real aspect today. We think that technology is going to solve everything. It certainly is important to support the work processes, but I think we also need to think about people, process, and space as we think about the technologies. And it's not as if we're all born collaborators. I think we need to learn how to collaborate and put some of the new tools to best use when we're remote.
Yeah, it's interesting on that needing to learn to collaborate. This is kind of what you're doing at the moment, Marit. Have you and your team faced any difficulties in convincing other people for a broader, more cultural approach to the future of work?
No, I'm actually quite happy with the holistic approach we're having in the organization I work for. I thought we would more be only looking at the tech side, but people are actually quite aware of the cultural and leadership side, but also that you can have the tech, but then you still need to adopt and work with the tech and apply new skills, learn to work differently, and there's a lot of attention for that. I think also because now at least we are working fully remote, so in this whole virtual world, and you see new challenges rise and new problems rise, and there's quite some awareness for that, so that's really helpful. Yeah,
and well, we're talking a lot about collaboration today, but I do think we kind of need to define that a bit more. So I mean, maybe John Cydwick, so what kind of collaboration is most important to prepare for now? Are we merely talking about in-house collaboration between teams, or is it broader than that, or going further between companies, or even how you communicate with the virtual economy?
That's a great question, and in this John Egan's world of metaverse, which I still don't understand, I still want to sell my $28 million virtual home if anybody would like to buy it. But we're all in this kind of virtual world, and I actually have a problem getting to the end of a day-averse, let alone metaverse. But the world we're in is all about digital workflow, and that's the big change, is that when people were fixed to one location, those locations were designed to get people working in them within their workflow, whatever their job was designed to be. And I think collaboration now is so much wider. We're talking about working from your home to Starbucks to a new fluid environment at work. I mean, great news about vaccines this week, the last 2 weeks, but going back to work will be fundamentally different. People will be looking at much more fluid workspaces. So collaboration is about digital workflow. It's keeping people attached to their workflow, whether it's from their mobile device, which could be something like Microsoft Duo, or it could be a Surface Hub, or it could be a full meeting room. It's making sure that people can work in that environment seamlessly and without thinking about what their UI is doing. And that's not just collaborating, that's actually enabling them to do the job that they need to do without worrying about the technology. And Nancy's absolutely right. The people, the process, and the space, and the technology, they all work really well together in the ideal scenario. So not collaboration, it's much wider than that now.
So if you bring this over to you, Nancy, now you have a lot of experience with conferences and such, which is even a grander scale collaboration. Do you think it's tough when you have these meeting points between different companies? Because within companies, they can implement a certain workflow for collaboration and make it quite, they can just create the rule, basically. But now when you have two different groups meeting, are you seeing any problems there or new challenges?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I would call them problems as much as I would say that they are opportunities. I think companies have been working with each other for a long period of time, and you build up norms and processes, how you work. So I see this really as an opportunity. we have fast forwarded and done something in the last 8 months that was otherwise going to take us maybe 5 or 6 years to accomplish. And that is something that we are going to take with us into the future, vaccine or no vaccine. We are committed now, and I say we, the broader collective of we, the people who are actually working, where we don't want the same norms that existed before. But that does mean that we need to learn how to use new tools. We're engaged with quite a number of very large companies where teams of people, change agents and coaches, support people, IT people, where they're looking at applications where they want to lay down the methodology for collaborating, how they're going to use these tools both within their organization and with external organizations. So I see not problems, but opportunities in the future.
Yeah, this has certainly been sped up, the change. I can remember beginning of this year, I never wanted to join in on meetings via calls. I wanted to be there in person, despite being relatively tech savvy, excuse me. But I guess we've all kind of shifted our perspective. And Marit, how are you seeing this change? Now you were in a role that seems quite obvious to have now post-pandemic, but this was kind of a future-looking role at ABN AMRO beforehand, leading this kind of big shift, and now all of a sudden it was been sped up by many years.
Yeah, so we were actually thinking and envisioning the future of work already before COVID, but then one of the experiments we wanted to start was actually a working from home experiment. So we got a little help by the pandemic crisis. So that really fast forward things, and now there's a lot of urgency and a lot of need for this, whereas in the beginning we had to convince people more about the future of work and what we see and envisioned for the future. And now actually, because of all a lot of assumptions we had before COVID were invalidated. Like you can't be a team when you work remote, or leadership is done by walking around, or productivity levels will go down when you work more in a virtual world. And a lot of those assumptions have now been invalidated. And I think that really helped us to move forward. And also, if we look at the adoption of technology, that fast forwarded so much in our company. And I think we are doing now things we probably wouldn't have done in 2 years if it wasn't for the crisis. And I think most of the learnings we have now we can use moving forward. And so I think, whereas we were working on it before, you now see that the things we're doing now and the role I have within that is actually, it fast forwarded a lot due to the crisis.
That's really interesting. And now if we kind of broaden it up a bit more, John, Egan, you talked about the tension between labor versus capital. So I kind of want to ask you about, are we seeing a tension between leaders and employees in terms of how we're approaching collaboration or talking about the future of work? Because those seem to be quite different things, as you mentioned, depending on the perspective.
It certainly depends on how we define leaders. I mean, the inference there is that leaders and employees are somewhat different, but in most organizations, leaders are two employees and suffer from a lot of the same vulnerabilities and concerns. I think it's more a case of the consequences outside of environmental change. Probably the most significant sociocultural challenge we're facing today is economic inequality, rising wealth and income inequality, and declining social mobility is creating enormous tension, which we see manifest as radical politics and protests around the world for the last decade. And that's felt very, very acutely, I think, by most employees. The majority of employees we can see, and this is in Europe and the US, we can see are not in a financial position where they can support themselves for multiple months in the event of a redundancy. So that pressure, that tension is always felt. So I am always inclined to think that as we look at the future of work, and I think the future of work over the last 8 months is being repurposed as a conversation about remote working, which is, in my mind, very problematic because that's this tiny, tiny part of the future of work. And some might say that should have been a conversation we had decades ago anyway, because the office environment as it's designed now was kind of a sequel to the factory environment as the tertiary industry emerged, and it was never really questioned or queried. Even when technology was introduced that could facilitate more distributed working environments, it wasn't something which was designed for that purpose. So, and then as cities became far more expensive to live in, and more offices and more businesses began to congregate in very expensive city centers, it put more and more pressure on the economic infrastructure of the city and on the ability of individuals to live in an environment close to their work. And I think if we simplify it, it's that idea that the average person earning an average income in an average job should be able to live close to where they work. And until that happens, then you are going to continue to see these problems. So I don't know if I would create the suggestion that leadership and the employee are at odds with each other. Of course, there's leadership within employee core as well. But I think there's certainly a question to be asked now about the nature of the organization and the relationship they have with employees, and the clarification of that over time, and the ways in which technology plays a role as we see technology. And to be frank, I'm not somebody who believes, generally speaking, that technology is going to create more redundancies than it creates opportunities. In fact, I believe the opposite. I think technology will create more opportunities. The problem comes that when we're in the current environment, certainly exacerbated and expedited by the virus, that technology is now replacing more and more jobs because it's technology can't get COVID. So we see increased levels of automation, robotics, and AI. And as a consequence, we're going to see high levels of structural unemployment, and that will create even greater tension for workplace environments moving forward and disempower remaining labor forces that exist within workplaces. That, I think, is a very live concern that needs to be considered by all organizations moving forward.
Yeah, that certainly is a bleak outlook, but still, I mean, we have to be aware of possible issues if we were on make the future the way we want it to be. But now, John Cydwick, so what do you think of John Egan's approach here to the future work? Do you think it should be looked at this broad, or is actually focusing on remote work fine for now in terms of what we're trying to figure out with the future work as everybody goes through this change, working, while most of us having to change how we approach work today?
Yeah, I think I'll be a bit more positive than John in terms of where I think we'll be. We certainly have seen a big change, but the reality is people are very social beings, and you see a ton of surveys where at the beginning it was productivity was fine, people's happiness was fine at the beginning of the pandemic, but the more surveys you see, the more unhappy people are and the less productive they are. And also we see surveys about creativity, input, staff development. Not being together as social animals is certainly starting to impact on how, I think, company health, and that company health is driven by people's health. So I do see a much more mixed and fluid environment, as we were talking about earlier, and making sure that people are actually happy to work in whatever environment they are in, but making sure that workplaces are less structured, more flexible, more inclusive in terms of how people use them. I think John's right in terms of city centres. I mean, I think the idea of thinking it's a great idea to wake up on a Monday morning when it's raining and cold and drive 2 hours into work, spending most of it doing 15 miles an hour, I don't think is good to anybody. The idea of finishing at 6 o'clock on a Friday, leaving your office and actually being in your kitchen drinking a beer at 2 minutes past 6 on a Friday is great. So I do believe that flexibility will be here to stay. What will happen is a big focus on just using the technology to make things better and to enable people to live in whatever environment and work in whatever environment they're in. And I think to do that, we need to focus on actually training people to live in the new world. Programs to enable and activate people to actually use the technology we're providing. I'm still so surprised about people I talk to, both in business and friends, who technology is being dumped on them and there is no enablement training, no support levels, no way of these people being actually taught how to live in this new world. Now, it's difficult for enterprises to do it when everybody is still largely at home. But one of the big responsibilities I think we'll have in the workplace moving forward is actually teach people to use this technology correctly. Because unless people are activated to do it and proactively supported in how that works, the impact of the technology and therefore what their working lives are going to be like won't be as powerful as it should be.
That's a really interesting point you bring up on the flexibility, because sometimes it does feel that the technology might just be a new, more rigid scheme set around us. But Nancy, I would like to ask you, how do you ensure that new technologies and new implementation actually creates flexibility along with better ways of collaborating?
Well, I think you think about those technologies and your processes and where you want to go very thoughtfully. You know, dumping products on people is never really a good idea. But if you think back to the March-April timeframe, I think that we were all very much reeling from just the shock of the rapid expansion of the pandemic. And at least in my mind, I thought that it was a relatively, it was going to be a relatively short-lived experience. As the summer went on, I think reality has set in a little bit more, and we've understood some of the issues that John has raised about the social and human connection elements to work and collaboration. So I think we're in a different mind space today, and certainly leading a horse to water is one thing, but it takes everybody thinking about what the new world of work is going to be like. And I'd like to think that there's going to be very much a hybrid approach to things. We're in the midst of engaging with staff across our company to ask them what their experience has been like and how they see things moving forward. And while most people would say that it's been a positive experience to be at home, there is some sense that they would like to be in the office as well, not full-time, but for a set period each week or every couple of weeks, so that they can get that human connection back, and some of the very positive elements of, just running into team members in the office to spark new ideas, etc.
Yeah, I can certainly relate to that. I mean, I do miss the quick chats that feel almost too small to actually send a message or book a meeting, but sometimes ideas just kind of happen on the fly when you're at the water cooler. But it's also important to note, as you say, that the future is hybrid. And Marit, you also mentioned this about future work. I mean, of course, we won't have lockdown forever, or at least we hope so. So, I mean, what is the future actually like? So are you already working towards that hybrid model that Nancy mentioned?
Yeah, so we also see the future for us is more flexible, so people alternating between the physical and the virtual world. We did quite some research in the organization. It's actually quite comparable to what Nancy said, that we see that most people would love to work remote a couple of days, 2 or 3 days, but they do really miss the social interactions and the random encounters at the coffee machine. So I think in the future for us, it will be more flexible or a hybrid, whatever you like to call it. And then I think we would go to the office to really meet each other for creative sessions, so where that meeting and the interaction is really important. And other things we will do more virtual in the nearby future. And what we see now is that we're doing a lot of interventions, either to help people because they have certain needs, or helping them with their home office, which are a bit more COVID related. So it's a bit more in the here and now, but also with the future in mind. So for instance, we're helping people to create a good home office, also because we know that in the future we will work more remotely, and other interventions as well. So in terms of collaboration, but also in terms of seeing how we can somehow create those random encounters. They will never be the same, but still I think there's an element in there which is valuable. So we're thinking, how can we recreate that in a virtual world to also meet that objective?
Yeah, so I've got a lot more questions for you, but we're also getting a lot in from the chat. So I think we'll move on to the Q&A now, just so we can hear what our audience is thinking. And I'll start with, so this question is for John and Cydwick and Nancy. So I'll start with you, John Cydwick. Do you feel VR could be used in 2021 and beyond to create more immersive meetings?
I certainly think AR will be a big part of the way that we start to interface, particularly in industry. And that's already happening. You know, I think we'll see less traveling, more using things like AR. Kind of VR, I think it's going back to this whole thing about how people love to communicate in real life. I've been fortunate enough to be in the States for a couple of meetings or a couple of weeks and having real life meetings with real life people in real life meeting rooms together. And honestly, the experience is so much fulfilling. And I just would want to make one point. We talk about home working as if everybody lives in a nice place with great connectivity, with the space to build some form of office environment without a ton of people in the same area. Most people don't. I mean, that's kind of like quite a privileged view. And I think we've got to be careful in these things that we just don't take that privileged view of life that everybody has got a great working environment. Many people don't, particularly people starting their careers. So we really have to be aware of kind of who we're talking about. You know, we're not just talking about a narrow community, we're talking about a very broad workspace of people. I've now forgotten your question.
Well, yeah, I was about the VR, but I really like your last point, because if we look behind the curtains here, I mean, I've rearranged my whole apartment just to bring my kitchen table in front of my bookcase. My girlfriend is stuck behind the door here, so we've all had to adjust to people that are living in small apartments. But I also want to ask you, Nancy, so what do you feel about VR's potential to make more immersive meetings in 2021?
Yeah, you know, I'm not sure that the immersive part is the biggest element of meetings. And so I would say near term, I'm just not so sure about that. What I would say is that we need to learn how to meet better. Maybe we need to become expert meeters and have shorter meetings, so those bursts are truly bursts. They're very short, and so that we're all not as tired from the whole impact of video meetings.
Yeah, so it does sound a bit like you're considering VR as a symptom of, well, as a one case of maybe focusing too much on the technology instead of the kind of whole picture when we approach the future of work. So I've got another, yeah, there are tons more coming in. This one I'm gonna direct to you, Marit. What about handling work-life balance while continuously being connected digitally? Is this something you've had to change at ABN AMRO, something different from pandemic and now?
Yeah, so what we see is that it's really different for different people, also a bit like John said. And I think you have people, for instance, who had difficulties before COVID with separating work-life balance. They struggle even more now. And I think that's something to really be aware of as a company. There are also people who are actually really happy with this work-life mix. They're more the integrators. I'm one of them as well. I really like it when things mingle, but I think it's really important to be mindful of what people need, and that you sometimes also need to help people with that. And there are a lot of different needs amongst many colleagues in our organization. So I think it's really good to also see who needs what and when. There's no one size fits all.
All right, so next question. I do feel a bit personally attacked by that one, but I'll read it anyway. And I'm gonna address this to John Egan. So we have the technology, but what about the efforts that require people to change their culture, accepting video, learning digital distancing when working from home? So I guess this is a bit about like the shift, perhaps for millennials, but we'll get a bit into that. But then the last part of the question is, and more importantly, when will people stop joining panels with bookshelves behind them? I'm not sure what that's meant, how that's directed at me, but okay.
So I've kind of been joking about the second part of the question, which is now our background is kind of our suit in the current environment, because you look very peculiar if you turn up to a video call wearing a suit when you're at home. So it feels like people dressing their bookcases has now been the proxy for addressing themselves and making statements with the books behind them or whatever it happens to be. I think this has been a fascinating kind of dissection of intentionality on social media over the last 8 months. I don't think that's going to stop anytime soon. For as long as we see people on TV, for instance, on Zoom, we're going to continue to see that, I suspect. To the first part of the question, I'm maybe not best placed to answer that. I think we're at this kind of moment of extraordinary change. We might be on the precipice of one of those decades of great change, and there's a lot of intersectionality occurring at once. And it's difficult to think in a kind of a linear way and assume that we can plot a straight line from here to 2 years down the road, or 5 years down the road, or 10 years down the road. I think what's likely to happen is we're going to see significant technological and sociocultural and environmental shift all occur at the one time. And that's very much, I think, going to shape a lot of the cultural environment. One thing I would say, building on the point of Marit and John, is that when we think about the suitability of working from home for people, there's two things to bear in mind. Sometimes people want to work from home now or want to work from the office now, depending on their current situation. You know, maybe you live in a small apartment and you've got 2 kids and you want to get out of it, or you've got no kids and the apartment is just fine. Oftentimes that situation changes. So as you get older, that might invert. So the person who wants to be in the office now might want to be at home later. And there's issues with that as well, because I think what we're beginning to see is that total divorce from the office space and the power center can also mean divorce from the politics and the power that might result in promotions and success in the future. So there's a trade-off there that kind of people have to keep in mind. I also think we need to consider how the city space itself is likely to evolve into the future, and how that's going to have an impact on the viability of living close to the office, like I mentioned before. But certainly a flexible environment is important. The last thing I'd say is that, to be the voice of caution again, I think when we talk about technology all the time, we are far less naive about technology now than we were 10 years ago. We understand that our technology is often leveraged against us for somebody else's commercial gain. So, you know, our voice data is mined, our text data is mined in order to sell us propositions all the time. As we integrate organizational technology into our homes in a way that's never happened before, so we're going to put employer-owned microphones and video cameras and sensors in our home if we're working flexibly, that's a new set of challenges we haven't encountered before, and one to think about now because it poses certain ethical problems we'll need to deal with. It's not a small thing, but one to bear in mind, and one that will certainly impact the notion of culture moving forward.
Yeah, that definitely is a big change. Now, the next question I wanted to direct to you, Nancy. Do you think there will be lasting change from designing for efficiency to designing for resilience in a work from home environment? And yeah, where it is more difficult to share knowledge and critical skills?
You know, I do think that there is lasting change that's going to come from this, and it is building resiliency. And first, resiliency has to come from a mindset, right? We can work in a different way. You know, let me just tie this back a little bit to an element in your previous question about students learning from home. I'm highly empathetic to university students who found themselves learning from home with really nothing added, just what they might have experienced in the classroom now moved into the virtual realm. And so I think that that is phase one of a technology implementation or deployment. It was the replication of what people thought was the education experience, just moving that into the virtual world. Well, where do you get the enhancements, the improvements, the add-ons, so that the totality of the experience is a good one for university students, and then just port that to business and non-education as well. The same challenges are there. How do you get people to see that there's an improvement in the way that they work and therefore the way that they live?
That's interesting because, I mean, of course, universities are kind of more formalized knowledge sharing than often within the business. So this next question is actually quite related to that and might be our last one, seeing that the time is running out. But this one is for John Cydwick. How do you feel about knowledge sharing being more difficult in a work from home environment, namely without socializing? So, and then we're specifically looking at our new knowledge management systems needed in the future, because now a lot of institutional memory comes from these quick chats and Friday beers.
Yeah, I think everybody's got to try doubly hard at trying to make sure that everybody's engaged in a learning process. So yes, LMS platforms that are more inclusive, more interactive are really important, but actually pushing more into personal touch. I'm amazed at some of the teaching environments that we're seeing that people are doing and having to pivot to doing over the last few months, where teachers and schools that had no experience at all from formalized virtual learning have made those as personal as possible. So I think it's making sure they're personal and making sure that the engagement is real, not virtual in terms of algorithmic measurement. I think we've all been on the end of those, and there's nothing personal about that sort of situation. And I do, as Nancy said, we're empathise with the university students of now, although I do know a few, and I've got one of my colleagues whose university student quite enjoys the lockdown because I think they just have more parties from the pictures I've seen anyway. So I think people are enjoying themselves, but the virtual learning environment really needs to overemphasize personal touch, not just relying on automated systems.
All right, thank you. That's unfortunately all the time we'll have for the audience questions for now. I want to thank you, John, and Nancy, so much for sharing your thoughts here today. And we'll now move on to On the Sofa section in the studio with Marit and Callum in just a moment. Stay tuned.